Welcome to the Story Atelier, where every story is a masterpiece. Here, we bring you the most captivating tales, filled with unexpected twists, heartfelt lessons, and unforgettable moments. If you love stories that inspire, entertain, and make you think, then you've found the perfect place to be. New stories are waiting for you every day. And the best part? It's completely free. So, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. By subscribing, you'll never miss out on the latest videos and will help us continue to create incredible content for you. Thank you for supporting the Story Atelier, your home for the most amazing stories. Now, sit back, relax, and let today's tale take you on an unforgettable journey. The evening air was crisp, the kind that made every breath feel sharper, clearer. Lucas Hayes adjusted his tie and tightened his grip on the worn leather briefcase in his hand. It had been another grueling day at Strata Corp, where he worked as a mid-level marketing associate. As he wove through the sea of people on the crowded city sidewalks, his thoughts were already drifting toward the comfort of his tiny studio apartment and the takeout waiting in his fridge. Lucas was a man of routine, not prone to deviations or surprises. But that night, something, or rather, someone, disrupted his carefully charted path. As he turned down a quieter street, his pace slowed. There, seated on the cold concrete beneath a flickering street lamp, was a woman. Her skin was deep brown, her hair wild and unkempt, and her clothes mismatched and threadbare. A cardboard sign in front of her bore a simple plea: fallen on hard times. Any help appreciated. Lucas hesitated. He wasn't the type to stop. He often rationalized it by telling himself he had nothing to offer. Yet tonight, he felt rooted in place. There was something in the way the woman sat, her back straight, her chin slightly raised. She didn't seem to shrink from the world around her, despite her circumstances. "Excuse me," he said awkwardly, his voice softer than he intended. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his with a directness that unsettled him. Her gaze was steady, almost defiant, but there was a flicker of weariness too. "As all right as one can be, I suppose," she replied, her voice clear and articulate, betraying an education and composure that didn't match her appearance. "I'm Lucas," he offered, extending a hand. The gesture felt absurd as soon as he made it, but to his surprise, she took it. Her grip was firm. "Naomi," she said simply. Lucas hesitated again, unsure of what to say next. How did you end up here?" he asked finally, wincing at his own clumsiness. Naomi's expression flickered, and for a moment, Lucas regretted the question, but then she answered, her voice low and measured. "Life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. One thing goes wrong, and then another, and before you know it." She gestured vaguely at the sidewalk around her. "You're here." There was no self-pity in her tone, only quiet resignation. Lucas found himself captivated by her calm demeanor. He'd passed countless homeless people before, but there was something about Naomi that drew him in. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing it was inadequate. "Is there anything I can do?" Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're kind to ask, but I'm not looking for handouts. Just a chance to rebuild." The words lingered in the air between them. Lucas nodded, the beginnings of an idea forming in his mind. "Actually," he began hesitantly, "there might be something." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her curiosity evident. "Oh, well," Lucas continued, shifting his weight nervously. "My office is throwing a big party next week. Employees are supposed to bring a +1. And, well, I don't exactly have a date." Naomi's smile widened, though her eyes betrayed amusement more than anything. "You're inviting a homeless woman to your office party?" When she put it that way, it did sound ridiculous. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, suddenly flustered. "I know it sounds crazy, but I don't know. There's something about you. I think you'd fit right in. And maybe it could be a chance for something good to happen." Naomi studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. Finally, she said, "That's unexpected, but even if I wanted to go, I don't exactly have a suitable outfit for a corporate event. I could help with that," Lucas said quickly, then immediately regretted how presumptuous it sounded. "I mean, only if you're okay with it." To his relief, Naomi didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." Lucas paused, considering her question. "I guess. I believe everyone deserves a chance. And something tells me you have a lot to offer." Naomi, her expression softened slightly, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. But then she shook her head. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case." "It's not charity," Lucas insisted. "Think of it as an opportunity for both of us. I get a +1, and you get a night off from." He gestured vaguely at their surroundings. Naomi chuckled, a warm, melodic sound that transformed her face. "You make a compelling argument, Lucas," But I have one condition. Name it, Lucas said eagerly. If I do this, Naomi said, her tone serious, I want the chance to repay your kindness someday. I need you to understand, I'm not taking this lightly. Lucas nodded, touched by her integrity. Deal. They shook hands, sealing their unusual agreement. As Lucas walked away that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something extraordinary in motion. The next day, Lucas found himself wandering through a second-hand clothing store with Naomi. She scanned the racks with an air of quiet determination, eventually selecting a simple black sheath dress. What do you think? She asked, holding it up for Lucas to see. He studied the dress, noting its elegant simplicity. I think it's perfect, he said. Why don't you try it on? While Naomi disappeared into the changing room, Lucas waited, his thoughts swirling. Who was she, really? She spoke with a poise and intelligence that hinted at a past far removed from the street corner where he'd found her. When Naomi emerged, dressed in the sleek black gown, Lucas couldn't suppress a smile. You look amazing, he said sincerely. Naomi arched an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile. Not bad for someone who was sitting on a sidewalk yesterday. Huh? Lucas chuckled. Not bad at all. As they left the store, Lucas felt a strange mixture of excitement and anxiety. He knew the night of the party would bring its own set of challenges, questions, judgment, perhaps even ridicule, but for now, he focused on the moment. Naomi had agreed to step into his world, and he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. Little did he know just how right he was. The evening of the Strata Corp annual gala arrived quicker than Lucas had anticipated. The event was known as the company's social highlight of the year, a spectacle where networking, opulence, and subtle power plays took center stage. Lucas had attended in previous years, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. Tonight, he was bringing Naomi. The gala was held at the prestigious Westfield Grand Hotel, a towering edifice of luxury with glittering chandeliers and marbled floors. As Lucas stepped through the revolving glass doors with Naomi by his side, he couldn't help but notice how effortlessly she blended into the grandeur of the setting. Naomi was stunning in the simple black sheath dress they'd chosen, her hair styled into an elegant bun. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that turned heads as they entered the grand ballroom. Yet, Lucas couldn't ignore the undercurrent of nervousness in her gaze. A flicker of doubt she quickly masked with a polite smile. Are you ready? Lucas asked, leaning in as the hum of conversation filled the room. Naomi met his eyes, her lips curving into a faint, almost mischievous smile. I was born ready. The ballroom was a picture of opulence. A live jazz band played soft melodies in one corner, while waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved gracefully among the guests, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. High-ranking executives mingled in clusters, their conversations filled with murmurs of deals, strategies, and corporate ambitions. Lucas felt the weight of their stares as he introduced Naomi. This is Naomi, he said to his first small group of colleagues, a mix of marketing team members and operations staff. She's a friend. Naomi extended her hand, her smile warm but not overdone. It's a pleasure to meet you all, she said, her tone perfectly measured. The group exchanged pleasantries, but Lucas caught the way some of their eyes lingered on Naomi a moment too long. Their curiosity barely veiled. One of them, a young woman named Clara, leaned in toward Lucas when Naomi turned to greet someone else. She's not someone I've seen around before, Clara said with a subtle edge to her voice. How did you two meet? Lucas hesitated, his mind racing. Through mutual friends, he replied quickly, forcing a smile. Clara raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. As the evening progressed, Lucas and Naomi made their rounds through the room. Naomi's natural charm began to shine as she engaged with executives and employees alike, asking insightful questions and offering thoughtful comments. Despite her poise, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that they were under a microscope. He overheard snippets of whispered conversations. Who is she? Lucas brought her? Odd choice, don't you think? Maybe she's someone important. The murmurs grew louder when the company's VP of Finance, Henry Dalton, joined their circle, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s with a reputation for sniffing out corporate secrets. Henry greeted Naomi with a firm handshake. You've got quite the presence, Naomi, he said, his tone both complimentary and probing. What line of work are you in? Naomi smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling ever so slightly. I'm between opportunities at the moment, she said smoothly, but I've had experience in leadership roles. Lucas felt his pulse quicken. Leadership roles? That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't exactly the whole truth either. Henry narrowed his eyes, clearly intrigued. Interesting, he said, but before he could press further, Naomi turned the conversation back to him with a question about Stratacorp's recent expansion. Within moments, she had deftly redirected the discussion, leaving Henry visibly impressed. as Lucas escorted Naomi to the buffet table for a momentary reprieve. A familiar voice called out, "Lucas, my boy." It was Darren Holt, the director of marketing and Lucas's direct supervisor. Darren was a large man with a booming voice and a fondness for overly firm handshakes. Lucas plastered on a smile. "Darren, good to see you." He gestured to Naomi. "This is Naomi, my +1 for the evening." Darren's eyes flicked over Naomi, his expression unreadable. "Naomi," he repeated, his tone curious. "A pleasure." Naomi extended her hand, her posture impeccable. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Holt." Darren chuckled. "Please, call me Darren." He turned to Lucas, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Quite the catch you've brought tonight. You're full of surprises." Lucas laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. Darren's eyes lingered on Naomi for a moment longer before he excused himself, leaving an unsettling feeling in Lucas's chest. As the night wore on, the chatter in the room shifted. The buzz of the evening's events gave way to a collective anticipation. Stratacorp's enigmatic CEO, Richard Callaway, was expected to make his appearance. Callaway was a legend in the industry, a self-made billionaire known for his brilliance and intensity. He was also notoriously private, rarely appearing at public functions. "Does he always keep everyone waiting?" Naomi asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Lucas chuckled nervously. "It's part of his mystique." When Callaway finally entered, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The crowd parted as the tall, silver-haired man strode in, his piercing blue eyes scanning the room. He exchanged brief handshakes with key executives before his gaze landed on Lucas and Naomi. Lucas's stomach twisted as Callaway approached, his presence commanding. "Lucas Hayes," the CEO said, his voice low and measured. "I've heard good things about you." "Thank you, sir," Lucas managed, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. Callaway turned to Naomi, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are?" Naomi extended her hand, her expression calm. "Naomi Carter," she said simply. For a moment, Callaway's expression faltered, a flicker of recognition flashing across his face. It was so brief that Lucas almost thought he imagined it. But then Callaway smiled, an enigmatic curve of his lips, and said, "A pleasure." As he walked away, Lucas turned to Naomi, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that about?" Naomi's gaze followed Callaway, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. Later that evening, Lucas found Naomi standing by the grand piano in the corner of the room, her fingers lightly grazing the keys. She seemed lost in thought, her earlier confidence replaced by something more introspective. "Naomi?" Lucas approached cautiously. "You okay?" She looked up, her eyes softening when she saw him. "Fine, just thinking." Lucas hesitated before speaking. "This party, it's not just about networking for you, is it? There's something more." Naomi's gaze locked onto his, and for the first time that evening, her composure cracked ever so slightly. "You're right," she admitted, "but I'm not ready to talk about it. Not yet." Before Lucas could press further, a commotion erupted near the ballroom's entrance. Several guests turned, their whispers growing louder. Lucas followed their gaze and saw Callaway standing frozen, his face pale as he stared at Naomi. "What's happening?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Naomi turned slowly, her expression calm but her body tense. Callaway began walking toward them, his steps deliberate. When he stopped in front of Naomi, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth," he said, his tone filled with equal parts disbelief and emotion. "It's you." Lucas felt the world tilt. "Elizabeth?" he repeated, looking at Naomi in shock. "What's going on?" Naomi, or Elizabeth, held Callaway's gaze, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice steady. "It's been a long time." The room fell silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Lucas felt a cold wave of confusion and betrayal wash over him. Who was she, and what had he just walked into? The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Every guest, from the junior interns to the senior executives, had frozen in place, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. Stratacorp's CEO, Richard Callaway, stood mere feet from Naomi, no, Elizabeth, and the look on his face was one Lucas had never seen before, a mix of disbelief, anger, and something deeper, almost like longing. "Elizabeth," Richard said again, his voice louder this time, carrying across the room. "Where have you been?" Naomi, or Elizabeth, lifted her chin slightly, her posture as composed as ever. "That's a complicated question, Richard," she replied, her voice calm but tinged with an edge of defiance. "And I'm not sure this is the time or place for the answer." Lucas felt his world tilt. His pulse pounded in his ears as he tried to process what was happening. Elizabeth? Richard knew her, and not just knew her, he seemed deeply affected by her presence. Lucas stepped back instinctively, his gaze darting between the two. Richard, ignoring the murmurs growing among the guests, took a step closer to Elizabeth. "You disappeared," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "No one knew where you were. I searched everywhere. And now you just show up here?" Elizabeth's composure faltered for the first time that evening. She blinked, and for a moment, something raw flickered in her eyes. "I had my reasons," she said quietly, "and I never meant for you to find me." The tension was palpable, and the crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, began to shift. Conversations erupted in hushed tones as guests speculated about the scene unfolding before them. "Who is she? Elizabeth? That's not the name she gave earlier. Did she say he searched for her?" Lucas, his mind racing, finally found his voice. "Naomi," he began, his tone desperate. "Or, Elizabeth, or whoever you are, what's going on? Who are you?" Elizabeth turned to him, her expression softening. "Lucas, I'm sorry," she said, her voice earnest. "I never meant to drag you into this. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I owe you the truth." Before she could elaborate, Richard interjected. "The truth is long overdue." "Elizabeth," he said, his tone sharp, "you disappeared without a trace. Do you have any idea what that did to me? To us?" Elizabeth's jaw tightened, and her calm facade returned. "Yes, Richard, I do," she said firmly, "but you of all people should understand why I had to leave." Sensing the need for privacy, Darren Holt, ever the opportunistic director, stepped forward, clapping his hands loudly. "All right, everyone, let's give him some space. Shall we? Back to the party," he boomed, shepherding the crowd away. Reluctantly, the guests began to disperse, though their curious glances lingered. Richard gestured toward a side door. "Let's talk, now." Elizabeth hesitated but nodded. She turned to Lucas, her expression filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. "You can come too," she said softly. Lucas wanted to refuse, to demand answers right there in the ballroom, but the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him. Without a word, he followed them into a private lounge adjacent to the main hall. The room was smaller but no less grand, with plush leather chairs and a roaring fireplace that cast flickering shadows on the walls. Richard closed the door behind them, his movements deliberate. He turned to face Elizabeth, his jaw tight. "Start talking," he demanded. "Where have you been for the last 5 years?" Lucas's heart sank. 5 years? The timeline hit him like a freight train. Whatever Elizabeth's story was, it was far more complex than he'd imagined. Elizabeth sighed, running a hand over her face. "I didn't plan for this to happen," she admitted. "When I left, I thought it would be for a few months. I needed time to think, to process everything, but then things spiraled." "Spiraled how?" Richard asked, his tone cold but laced with a hint of desperation. Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at Lucas as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, she said, "After the accident, I couldn't stay. Everywhere I went, everything I did, it was a reminder of what we lost. I couldn't breathe. Richard, I felt like I was drowning." Lucas, standing silently by the fireplace, felt like an intruder in a deeply personal moment. He shifted uncomfortably. "Accident?" he asked cautiously. Elizabeth turned to him, her expression pained. "My daughter," she said quietly. "Our daughter. She didn't make it." The words hung heavy in the air. Lucas's chest tightened as the weight of her grief became palpable. He glanced at Richard, whose stoic exterior cracked at the mention of the tragedy. "I didn't know," Lucas murmured, his voice barely audible. "How could you?" Elizabeth replied, her tone soft. "I didn't want anyone to know. Not then." Richard broke the silence, his voice low but intense. "And after that? After you left? What happened?" Elizabeth hesitated again, her gaze distant. "At first, I thought I'd travel, get away from everything familiar. But then, I ran out of money. I didn't have a plan. Richard, I wasn't thinking clearly. One thing led to another, and I ended up on the streets." Lucas stared at her in disbelief. "You mean, all this time, you've been homeless?" Elizabeth nodded. "Not the entire time. I found work here and there, enough to scrape by, but it was hard to get back on my feet. Every time I thought I was making progress, something would knock me back down." Richard's fists clenched at his sides. "Why didn't you reach out? To me? To anyone? I would have helped you." Elizabeth's eyes flashed with anger. "Because I didn't want your pity. Richard, I didn't want to be a burden. And more than that, I didn't think I deserved your help after what happened." Richard's voice softened, his expression pained. "Elizabeth, none of that was your fault." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I've spent the last 5 years trying to find my way back. And now here I am, standing in front of you, hoping I haven't made a mistake." Lucas, who had been silent for most of the exchange, finally found his voice. "So, when I met you, Sitting on that sidewalk with a cardboard sign, that was real? You weren't just trying to, I don't know, test me or something? Elizabeth shook her head. It was real, Lucas. All of it. And when you stopped to talk to me, it was the first time in years that someone treated me like a human being. Not just a statistic or a problem to solve. Lucas's throat tightened. He didn't know whether to feel flattered or overwhelmed, or both. Richard exhaled deeply, running a hand through his silver hair. Elizabeth, he said, his tone steadier now, I don't care about the past anymore. What matters is that you're here. We can figure this out, together. Elizabeth hesitated, her gaze flickering to Lucas. I didn't plan for any of this. Richard, I don't know if I'm ready to step back into your world. You don't have to decide right now, Richard said gently, but I need you to know that you're not alone anymore. Lucas, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, stepped forward. Elizabeth, he said, his voice firm, you deserve a fresh start. And if there's anything I can do to help, you can count on me. Elizabeth looked at him, her expression softening. Thank you, Lucas, for everything. As the three of them left the lounge, the party winding down around them, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Elizabeth's return had stirred up questions, emotions, and unresolved conflicts, not just for Richard, but for himself as well. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain, his simple act of kindness had set into motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The days following the gala were a whirlwind for Lucas. Life at Strata Corp carried on as usual, or at least it appeared to. The reality was far more complicated. The shocking revelation about Naomi, Elizabeth, and her connection to Richard Calloway had rippled through the company like a seismic wave. The whispered speculation, subtle glances, and pointed questions were impossible to ignore. Lucas had tried to stay out of the fray, but avoiding the storm was easier said than done. Everyone wanted to know what he knew about Elizabeth, and his vague answers only fueled the rumors. Still, it wasn't just the gossip that troubled him, it was Elizabeth herself. She hadn't contacted him since the gala, and despite everything, he found himself worrying about her. One evening, as he sat in his apartment staring at his untouched dinner, his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. A strange sense of anticipation filled him as he answered. Lucas? The voice on the other end was unmistakable, calm, clear, and just a little hesitant. Elizabeth, he said, sitting up straighter. I was wondering if I'd hear from you again. A soft chuckle came through the line. Sorry for the silence. Things have been hectic. I can imagine, Lucas said, his tone cautious. How are you holding up? Better than I expected, she admitted, but I need your help with something. Elizabeth's request was simple but puzzling. Meet her at a small cafe on the edge of the city the next day. She gave no explanation, only promising that she would fill him in when they met. Lucas's curiosity overpowered his hesitation, and he found himself arriving at the cafe the following afternoon. The place was quiet, with mismatched chairs and a faint aroma of freshly baked bread. Elizabeth sat at a corner table, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail, dressed in casual clothes that somehow still radiated elegance. Thanks for coming, she said as Lucas approached. Of course, Lucas replied, taking the seat opposite her. What's going on? Elizabeth glanced around the cafe before leaning in slightly. I need you to trust me, she began. What I'm about to tell you, it's complicated. Lucas frowned but nodded. I'm listening. Elizabeth hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she said, after I left Richard, I thought I was escaping my grief. But I walked into something far worse. There were people I trusted who took advantage of my vulnerability. They made promises, offered help, and then turned their backs when I needed them most. Lucas leaned forward, his concern deepening. What kind of people? Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Investors, associates, people connected to Richard's world. They saw me as an opportunity, a way to exploit my connection to him for their own gain. Lucas's stomach churned. Are you saying they're still a threat to you? Elizabeth nodded. One of them, in particular. His name is Victor Cross. He's a major player in the corporate world, owns several businesses, including a private security firm. He's dangerous, Lucas, and he knows I'm back. Lucas's pulse quickened. What does he want? To silence me, she said bluntly. When I left Richard, I uncovered some of Victor's less than legal activities. I didn't realize what I had stumbled into until it was too late. If he thinks I'll expose him, he won't hesitate to protect himself. Lucas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What can I do to help? Elizabeth studied him for a moment, as if assessing whether he meant it. There's a file, she said finally, a physical file with documents proving Victor's crimes. I hid it years ago, but I need to retrieve it now. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Why not go to the police? Elizabeth shook her head. Victor has connections everywhere. If I go to the authorities without solid evidence, He'll bury me, and if I try to get the file myself, he'll know. You're saying I should get it for you? Lucas asked, his voice incredulous. I wouldn't ask if I had another option, Elizabeth said quietly. You're the only person I trust right now. Lucas hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. Where's the file? In a storage unit, Elizabeth said. I've kept it under a fake name, but I can give you the key and the address. That evening, Lucas found himself driving toward the outskirts of the city, the storage unit's address scribbled on a piece of paper in his pocket. The key Elizabeth had given him felt heavy in his hand, as if it carried all the risks and consequences of what he was about to do. The storage facility was a nondescript building, surrounded by a chain-link fence and dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights. Lucas parked his car and approached the office to sign in, doing his best to appear casual. The attendant barely glanced at him as he handed over the paperwork. Unit 345, the man said gruffly, sliding a clipboard across the counter. Lucas signed his name and made his way down the dimly lit corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the stillness. He reached the unit, his heart pounding as he inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with cardboard boxes and old furniture. Lucas scanned the room, his eyes landing on a metal filing cabinet in the corner. He hurried toward it, pulling open the drawers until he found a folder labeled VC Confidential. Just as Lucas stuffed the folder into his bag, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Slowly, he turned to see a man standing in the doorway, a large, broad-shouldered figure with a cold, calculating gaze. Evening, the man said, his voice low and menacing. You must be lost. Lucas's mind raced. He forced a nervous laugh. Just picking up some old files for my boss. He rents this unit. The man's eyes narrowed. Funny, because this unit hasn't been rented in years. Care to try again? Before Lucas could respond, the man stepped closer, his hand moving to his belt where a holstered weapon gleamed. Lucas's instincts took over. He grabbed the nearest box and hurled it at the man, bolting past him while he was distracted. The man shouted, and Lucas heard the unmistakable click of a gun being drawn. He sprinted down the corridor, weaving between rows of units as the man's heavy footsteps thundered behind him. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he burst out of the building and into the parking lot. Fumbling for his car keys, Lucas dove into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off just as the man emerged from the building, shouting after him. Back at his apartment, Lucas locked the door and leaned against it, his chest heaving. His hands trembled as he pulled the folder from his bag, flipping through its contents. What he found was damning financial records, correspondence, and photos tying Victor Cross to a web of illegal activities, from embezzlement to blackmail. He called Elizabeth immediately. Lucas, she answered, her voice tense. I got it, he said, his voice still shaky. But I wasn't alone. Someone was there. They saw me. Elizabeth's silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she said, then we need to move quickly. Meet me tomorrow morning. We're taking this to Richard. As Lucas hung up, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. This was bigger than he had imagined, and it was clear that Victor Cross wouldn't stop until he protected his secrets. The question now was whether Richard Calloway could be trusted, and whether Lucas and Elizabeth could survive long enough to find out. The next morning, Lucas drove to a secluded park where Elizabeth had asked him to meet her. He carried the incriminating folder in a messenger bag slung over his shoulder. His nerves frayed after the previous night's encounter. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound a warning. Elizabeth was waiting for him near a quiet bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. She looked composed, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed her tension. Did anyone follow you? She asked immediately as he approached. I don't think so, Lucas replied, glancing over his shoulder, but whoever was at the storage unit last night won't let this go. We need to act fast. Elizabeth nodded, her jaw tightening. We're taking this to Richard. He's the only one with the resources and power to stand up to Victor Cross. Lucas hesitated. Are you sure we can trust him? Her expression softened slightly. I don't know, she admitted, but he's not the man Victor is. Richard has his flaws, but he wouldn't condone what Victor's done. And I owe him the chance to help. With that, they got into Lucas's car and began the drive to Stratacorp's headquarters. Richard paused, his piercing gaze fixed on the folder. As Stratacorp grew, I saw Victor for what he truly was, a manipulator. Someone who thrived on exploiting weaknesses. I severed ties with him years ago. But clearly, that wasn't enough. Elizabeth crossed her arms, her voice edged with frustration. It wasn't just manipulation, Richard. He used me as leverage when I was vulnerable. When I left, I stumbled onto his illegal operations. He knew I could expose him, and he's been a shadow over my life ever since. Richard's eyes flicked to Elizabeth, and for a moment, they saw a vision. A woman, a woman who was capable of controlling her own destiny. She was the one I needed. 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 She was They softened. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, for everything. I should have been there for you. She nodded, acknowledging his words but not dwelling on them. It's not just about us. Richard, Victor is still dangerous. If we don't act, he'll continue ruining lives. Richard leaned against his desk, his expression thoughtful. Victor has deep connections, law enforcement, politicians, even corporate spies. Taking him down won't be easy, even with this evidence. Lucas, still standing near the door, spoke up. But it's possible, right? You're the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the country. If anyone can expose him, it's you. Richard nodded slowly. It'll require precise timing and strategy. First, we'll need to secure this evidence. Victor will come after it, and you, he said, glancing at Lucas and Elizabeth. He won't stop until he's neutralized the threat. Elizabeth's face hardened. Then we use his arrogance against him. He's always underestimated me. Let's make that his mistake. Richard allowed a faint smile. You haven't changed, always willing to fight, even when the odds are against you. Elizabeth met his gaze evenly. I've had to. As the three of them finalized their plan to expose Victor, a sharp knock at the office door interrupted them. Richard's assistant stepped in, her face pale. Sir, there's a situation. Security flagged an unauthorized visitor in the building, a man claiming to be with a private security firm. Richard's eyes narrowed. Victor's men, he muttered under his breath. How close? They're on the executive floor, she said. Security is trying to contain them. But, before she could finish, the sound of raised voices echoed from the hallway, followed by a loud crash. Lucas's heart pounded as he turned to Elizabeth. We need to go, now. Richard pressed a button under his desk, and a hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a narrow stairwell. This leads to a service exit, he said. Take it, I'll handle Victor's men. Elizabeth hesitated. Richard, go, he said firmly, cutting her off. I'll buy you time. Elizabeth nodded reluctantly, grabbing Lucas's arm as they hurried through the hidden door. The stairwell was dimly lit, and their footsteps echoed ominously as they descended. You think he'll be okay? Lucas asked, his voice low. Elizabeth's expression was grim. Richard can handle himself. He always has, but we need to stay ahead of Victor's men. As they reached the ground floor, Elizabeth pulled Lucas toward a service exit that led to an alleyway. They burst out into the cold air, only to find two men in dark suits waiting for them, their postures tense and menacing. Well, one of the men said, his voice dripping with mockery. The boss will be pleased. Hand over the folder, and we might let you walk away. Elizabeth stepped forward, her chin raised. Tell Victor he's not as untouchable as he thinks. The evidence is already in safe hands. The man smirked. Nice try, lady, but we both know you're bluffing. Lucas glanced at Elizabeth, panic rising in his chest. We can't fight them, he whispered. Elizabeth's eyes darted around the alley, searching for options. Then, she spotted a stack of crates near a fire escape. She leaned closer to Lucas and murmured, "Follow my lead." Before the men could react, Elizabeth grabbed a nearby trash can lid and hurled it at one of them. The improvised weapon struck his arm, causing him to stumble. At the same moment, she bolted toward the crates, pulling Lucas with her. "Stop them," one of the men shouted, giving chase. Elizabeth climbed the fire escape with surprising agility, and Lucas scrambled after her, his heart pounding. The men cursed below, one of them attempting to climb while the other pulled out a radio, likely to call for reinforcements. The fire escape led them to the roof of a neighboring building. Elizabeth and Lucas paused to catch their breath, but the sound of pursuit wasn't far behind. The rooftop was vast, with only a few ventilation units and a sheer drop on all sides. "We're trapped," Lucas said, his voice tight with fear. Elizabeth's gaze sharpened as she spotted a maintenance ladder leading to another building. "Not yet," she said. "Come on." As they ran, one of Victor's men emerged onto the rooftop, a gun in hand. "End of the line," he barked. Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression defiant. "You think this will stop us? Victor's empire is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do about it." The man sneered. "We'll see about that." Before he could raise his weapon, a blinding spotlight swept over the rooftop, followed by the sound of approaching helicopters. Lucas shielded his eyes as the wind whipped around them. A booming voice echoed from a loudspeaker. "This is law enforcement. Drop your weapon and stand down." The sight of the helicopters and SWAT officers descending onto the building was enough to make Victor's men surrender. As they were apprehended, Elizabeth turned to Lucas, relief evident on her face. "I wasn't bluffing," she said with a small smile. "I sent a copy of the evidence to the authorities this morning." Richard made sure they were ready. Lucas exhaled deeply, the weight of the night's events finally lifting. "You really had this planned out." Elizabeth's smile faded slightly. "I've spent years running, Lucas. It's time to stop." The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change. Victor Cross was arrested, his criminal empire dismantled by the evidence Elizabeth had provided. Stratacorp's reputation was bolstered by Richard's public support for the investigation, and Elizabeth's name was cleared. As for Lucas, his life took an unexpected turn. Richard offered him a promotion within Stratacorp's corporate social responsibility division, a role focused on helping others find second chances, much like the one Lucas had unknowingly given Elizabeth. Elizabeth, meanwhile, chose to remain close to the company, using her experience and resilience to help others who had been exploited by systems like Victor's. One crisp morning, as Lucas met Elizabeth for coffee, he reflected on how much had changed since that fateful encounter on the sidewalk. "You know," he said, "none of this would have happened if I hadn't stopped to talk to you that night." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes warm. "Sometimes, the smallest choices have the biggest impact. You changed my life, Lucas, and in doing so, you've helped change so many others." As they sat together, the future felt brighter than it had in a long time. Weeks later, as Lucas prepared for his first day in his new role, he passed by the same corner where he'd first met Elizabeth. A different woman sat there now, her face weary but hopeful. Without hesitation, Lucas approached her and offered a smile. "Good evening," he said gently. "Are you hungry? Let's get you something to eat." The woman's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with gratitude. In that moment, Lucas realized that kindness, no matter how small, was a force powerful enough to change the world. As we come to the end of this story, let's take a moment to reflect on what it truly means. Sometimes, life presents us with unexpected opportunities to make a difference, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of kindness, like stopping to talk to someone, lending a hand, or simply showing compassion. This story teaches us several important lessons. Kindness can change lives. Lucas's simple decision to stop and speak to a stranger didn't just help Elizabeth, it set off a chain reaction that transformed countless lives. We're reminded that even the smallest acts of empathy can create ripples far beyond what we imagine. Don't judge by appearances. Elizabeth's journey highlights the importance of looking beyond the surface. Every person has a story, a struggle, and a potential waiting to be uncovered. When we take the time to see people for who they truly are, we open doors to understanding and connection. Courage and resilience go hand in hand. Elizabeth's resilience in the face of hardship is a testament to the human spirit. Her courage to confront her past and fight for justice reminds us that even in the darkest times, we can rise and reclaim our lives. The power of forgiveness and redemption. The relationship between Richard and Elizabeth shows that forgiveness can be a bridge to healing, and redemption is always possible. It's never too late to mend broken relationships or take responsibility for past mistakes. We all have a role to play, whether it's through acts of kindness like Lucas's, leadership like Richard's, or bravery like Elizabeth's. This story reminds us that we all have the power to create change. It's not about how much we do, but about doing what we can with the resources and opportunities we have. So, what can we take away from this? Perhaps it's a reminder to slow down, to pay attention to the people around us, and to listen when someone needs to be heard. Maybe it's an encouragement to show kindness, not because we expect something in return, but because it's the right thing to do. The next time you see someone who looks like they could use a little help, whether it's a smile, a word of encouragement, or a helping hand, don't hesitate. You never know how much of an impact that one small gesture could have. After all, the world can always use a little more compassion. And sometimes, the lives we change aren't just those we help, but our own. Thank you for listening, and may this story inspire you to bring kindness into the world, one small act at a time.